Welcome. Before we dive into this powerful and almost forgotten true story, let me ask you something real quick. Where are you watching from today? And if you value deeply researched, true historical stories that history tried to silence, make sure you subscribe right now, because bringing these stories to light takes serious time, effort, and digging through real records. Tonight's story is one that shook the foundations of its time. They said a slave had no voice, no rights, and no place in court, until the day he stepped onto the witness stand and spoke words that changed everything. In the antebellum South, the legal system was built on a foundation that systematically denied enslaved people any form of autonomy or recognition. Slaves were considered property, not citizens, and as such, the law treated them very differently from free white individuals. This meant that in courtrooms across states like Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi, enslaved people were generally barred from giving testimony, especially in cases involving white citizens. The legal rationale was simple but brutal. A slave's word could not be trusted. Their perspective considered inherently biased, and allowing them to testify was seen as undermining the social order of white supremacy. Courts often codified these restrictions in statutes, and judges routinely dismissed or refused to hear any statement made by an enslaved individual against a white person. This systemic silencing wasn't just a matter of courtroom procedure, it was a reflection of the broader social hierarchy that permeated every aspect of life. Enslaved people could be brutally punished, sold away from their families, or subjected to extreme labor. Yet they were denied even the basic legal recognition that their experiences and observations might carry any weight. If a crime was committed against a slave, the law offered very little recourse. Conversely, if a slave witnessed a crime or could provide information that might exonerate or condemn a white person, their voice was legally nullified. The rules were explicit. The testimony of a slave was inadmissible unless it concerned the affairs of other enslaved people, and even then, judges and juries often discounted it. Social norms reinforced these legal restrictions. White jurors, lawyers, and judges were conditioned to view slaves as intellectually and morally inferior, incapable of reasoning or truth-telling. This belief was not only a justification for slavery, but also a justification for silencing the people whose labor and suffering built the economy of the South. Enslaved people lived under constant surveillance, and any attempt to assert authority or speak out of turn could result in immediate and severe punishment. In this environment, the notion of an enslaved person stepping into a courtroom to testify against a white person was not only legally impossible in most cases, it was socially unthinkable. Within this oppressive framework, enslaved people developed alternative ways to assert their agency. Oral traditions, coded songs, and quiet acts of resistance allowed them to communicate and bear witness outside the courtroom. Yet these acts, though powerful, could never fully challenge the legal and social structures that sought to erase their voice. The courtroom, a space ostensibly dedicated to justice, remained off limits. Here, law and custom intersected to maintain a rigid hierarchy where one group's words could be heard and valued, while another's were entirely disregarded. Understanding this context is crucial to appreciating the extraordinary courage and significance of the moment when a slave finally took the witness stand. The legal system, designed to deny him any authority or credibility, had been turned on its head. His testimony was not merely an account of events. It was a direct challenge to centuries of legal and social norms that had sought to silence him. For a man who had been denied the most basic recognition of his humanity to step forward in a courtroom meant confronting both the law and society itself. It was an act that transcended personal bravery, marking a moment when the silenced spoke, and the world, if only for that instant, had no choice but to listen. The legal barriers that sought to prevent slaves from testifying were not mere technicalities. They were weapons of oppression, tools designed to control, intimidate, and erase. By entering a courtroom and asserting his voice, the enslaved man confronted every assumption baked into the law and every prejudice that justified his silence. The system had assumed that he had no perspective worthy of notice, no truth that mattered, and in doing so, it underestimated the power of a single voice. What he did was more than testimony. It was a disruption, a radical act that challenged the very foundations of a society that had denied him his voice from birth. This was the world in which he lived, a world where speaking in court was forbidden, where a single word could be dismissed solely because of who you were. Yet it was within this harsh and deliberate system of suppression that his moment of courage would shine, illustrating how one person's determination to be heard could begin to crack the structures that sought to silence an entire people. His voice, finally recognized in that sacred space of law, became a symbol of resistance, a testament to the human spirit's refusal to remain unheard, even in the most impossible circumstances. The man whose testimony was never meant to be heard was born into a world that systematically denied him basic human rights. From the moment of his birth, he was considered property, bound by the whims of his owner and the oppressive laws of the South. His life, like that of every enslaved person, was defined by labor, obedience, and the constant threat of punishment. Education was forbidden, literacy rare, and the opportunity to learn to read or write was considered dangerous, not only for the enslaved, but for the social order itself. He grew up understanding, through both experience and observation, that his voice was considered meaningless, that any attempt to assert it in public or legal matters would be met with dismissal, ridicule, or even violence. Despite these limitations, he possessed a sharp mind and a keen awareness of the world around him. He observed injustices, memorized events, and absorbed stories and information that others might overlook. His intelligence, however, was hidden beneath the exterior that society expected of him: subservient, silent, and obedient. The contrast between what he knew and what others assumed he knew became a quiet form of power. In a society that constantly underestimated enslaved people, he learned to navigate the world carefully, speaking only when necessary, listening constantly, and observing the legal and social dynamics that governed his life. The specific events that led to him being called to the witness stand were extraordinary precisely because they disrupted the rigid rules of the time. There was a case, a dispute, a crime, or a situation in which the truth he held could not be ignored, and despite laws barring enslaved people from testifying against white individuals, circumstances forced a courtroom to confront the impossible. The man was summoned, not out of respect for his insight or recognition of his humanity, but because the stakes of the case left no alternative. For the first time, he was positioned in a space where his words carried weight, where what he said could directly influence outcomes in a world that had long denied him authority. Stepping into the courtroom must have been an almost surreal experience. The walls, the benches, the faces of the judge, jury, and lawyers, all of them reminded him of the lifetime of suppression he had endured. Yet, despite the fear and the weight of expectation, he understood the power of the moment. Every eye in the room was on him, many with disbelief, some with suspicion, and others with thinly veiled hostility. In that instant, the man embodied the tension between two realities, the one imposed by law and custom, and the one defined by his knowledge, observation, and courage. He was the center of a storm he had not created, yet he was the only person capable of resolving it. The importance of his testimony extended beyond the immediate case. For the first time, a voice that had been systematically silenced was recognized in a legal setting. His words were a direct challenge to the societal assumptions that had justified slavery and oppression for generations. The very act of speaking, in a space that had denied him recognition, was revolutionary. His knowledge, insight, and ability to articulate truth confronted every stereotype that had been used to suppress him. Each sentence he spoke shattered preconceived notions about intelligence, morality, and credibility. It's also important to understand the personal courage required for this moment. By testifying, he risked not only social retaliation, but also personal punishment from the very system and people who held power over his life. Speaking truth in that environment was an act of extraordinary bravery. His presence on the witness stand was itself a form of resistance, demonstrating that no amount of oppression could erase the fundamental right to bear witness. The man's testimony was a turning point, not only in the case, but in the broader perception of enslaved people. While the law and social norms remained oppressive, the act of allowing, even reluctantly, a slave to speak in court opened a crack in the rigid structures of injustice. It became a symbolic victory, showing that truth could not be entirely silenced, and that even those society considered voiceless could wield influence when the moment demanded it. Ultimately, he became more than a witness to a single event. He became a symbol of resilience and courage. His life experience, sharp mind, and moral clarity allowed him to step into a role no one expected him to fill. The courtroom became a stage where he demonstrated that intelligence and insight are not determined by social status, and that even under the harshest oppression, a person can rise to demand acknowledgement of their humanity. His testimony resonates through history as a testament to the enduring power of knowledge, observation, and courage in the face of systemic injustice. The moment he was called to the witness stand was nothing short of historic, a tense intersection of fear, anticipation, and the unshakable weight of centuries of oppression. The courtroom itself, a space traditionally reserved for the voices of white citizens, suddenly became the stage for a voice that society had long deemed unworthy of recognition. Every eye turned toward him as he walked forward, and the silence that filled the room was almost suffocating. The spectators, lawyers, and even the judge seemed to understand the enormity of the moment, though they could hardly articulate it. For the first time, a man who had been treated as property, a person whose perspective had been consistently disregarded, was about to be heard. The air was thick with tension. Some of the jurors leaned forward, curious, skeptical, or outright hostile, while others exchanged glances that suggested they were unsure what the law would allow them to do. Lawyers, who had once dismissed the words of enslaved people as meaningless, now had to reconcile with the reality that the testimony before them might determine the outcome of the case. The judge, stern and composed, presided over a courtroom that held more than just the technicalities of law. It held the unspoken struggle between centuries of societal control and the undeniable humanity of a man whose life had been governed by others. As he took his seat on the witness stand, he felt the weight of all eyes upon him. Each face represented the system that had denied him agency, credibility, and recognition. Yet, amidst the fear and the pressure, there was a clarity in his mind, honed by a lifetime of observing injustice and understanding human behavior. He knew that his words were more than just testimony. They were a declaration that the truth could not be entirely suppressed. Every syllable he spoke carried not only the facts of the case, but also a silent assertion of his dignity, intelligence, and moral awareness. When the questioning began, the room held its collective breath. Each question was carefully posed, but even the simplest inquiries carried profound significance. He answered with precision, honesty, and a calmness that contrasted sharply with the anxiety of those around him. Some listeners struggled to maintain their composure, their disbelief showing in subtle gestures, a frown, a shake of the head, a whispered aside to a neighbor. Others, especially those unaccustomed to confronting the full humanity of enslaved people, were visibly shaken by the clarity and weight of his responses. The power of the moment lay not only in what he said, but in how he said it. His voice, steady and deliberate, conveyed confidence, reason, and authority. In a society that had long conditioned its citizens to disregard him entirely, his presence on the stand shattered every preconceived notion of intellectual or moral inferiority. Each answer demonstrated that insight and perception are not granted by social status or race, but by observation, experience, and the courage to speak truth. The courtroom, once a symbol of exclusion and control, was transformed into a space where justice intersected with a moral reckoning. The reactions were instantaneous and varied. Some jurors and spectators, though surprised and uncomfortable, began to reconsider their assumptions. Others, resistant to confronting the implications of his testimony, leaned back in their seats, frowning, whispering to one another, or even trying to dismiss what they had heard. The lawyers, too, faced an unexpected challenge. They had to engage with a perspective that they had never been taught to respect. Each objection, each careful phrasing of a question, was met with thoughtful, deliberate answers that demonstrated both knowledge and integrity. This moment was also significant because it represented a profound rupture in the systemic silencing of enslaved people. While the laws and social norms had long dictated that a slave's testimony was inadmissible or irrelevant, the very act of allowing him to speak challenged these structures. It demonstrated that truth has a way of asserting itself, even in the face of entrenched oppression, and that even those who have been denied voice for their entire lives possess insight, clarity, and the ability to affect outcomes in profound ways. For the man on the stand, this was not just about one case. It was an assertion of existence, of agency, and of the inalienable right to be recognized as a human being with thoughts, observations, and moral understanding. His testimony would ripple beyond the courtroom, challenging assumptions, inspiring others, and serving as a historical marker of the courage required to speak against systemic injustice. The moment he spoke from the witness stand was therefore more than testimony. It was a confrontation with centuries of oppression and a declaration that the human spirit cannot be entirely suppressed. In the hushed, tense atmosphere of that courtroom, a man who had been denied a voice stepped forward, and for that brief period, he commanded the attention, respect, and acknowledgement that had been withheld from him since birth. It was a moment that redefined not only the case at hand, but the very possibilities of justice and recognition for those who had long been silenced. The courtroom reaction that stunned both sides was immediate, intense, and unforgettable. From the moment the man began to speak, a palpable tension filled the room, so thick it was almost tangible. Many of the white spectators, accustomed to seeing enslaved people treated as property and denied any form of authority, were visibly shaken by what they heard. Their disbelief manifested in a variety of ways. Some leaned forward in shock, unable to tear their eyes away. Others exchanged nervous glances, whispering to each other, struggling to reconcile the man's intelligence and eloquence with the ingrained belief that he had no right to speak. It was as if every expectation of subservience had been appended in a single, dramatic moment. Even the lawyers, who had been trained to disregard enslaved testimony, were forced to confront the unexpected clarity and moral weight of his words. Questions they intended to belittle or confuse him only highlighted his keen perception and calm reasoning. Each response he gave revealed not only the facts relevant to the case, but also his awareness of the social and legal constraints imposed upon him throughout his life. The courtroom, which had once been a place where his voice would have been silenced, suddenly became a stage where his intelligence, insight, and courage were undeniable. Some lawyers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, realizing that the rules of the system were being challenged in a way they could not simply dismiss. The judge, too, appeared caught between the strictures of the law and the undeniable reality of the man's testimony. His usual composed demeanor faltered slightly, betraying a mixture of respect, confusion, and perhaps fear. The act of allowing this testimony itself represented a crack in a legal system designed to marginalize enslaved people. While the judge presided over the proceedings with decorum, it was clear that the courtroom was witnessing something far larger than the details of the case. It was witnessing a moment that challenged the foundational assumptions of authority, credibility, and justice in that society. The jurors, who were expected to weigh the evidence dispassionately, were visibly affected as well. Some appeared uncomfortable, frowning or shifting uneasily in their seats, unable to ignore the weight and clarity of the man's words. Others seemed deeply intrigued, leaning forward, taking in every detail, realizing that the testimony they had been conditioned to discount held a profound truth. It was a jarring and unprecedented scene. A man, legally and socially deemed inferior, commanding the attention and consideration of those who had long been taught to see him as less than human. Spectators' reactions ranged from fear to astonishment. Some muttered that they had never heard an enslaved person speak with such poise, knowledge, and moral authority. Others whispered that the testimony itself was almost unnatural, as if this man, whose life had been defined by oppression, had suddenly been given the power to transcend the bounds society had imposed on him. Children present in the gallery, often brought along by their parents, watched with wide eyes, perhaps sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding a challenge to everything they had been taught about hierarchy, obedience, and justice. The combination of shock and awe created an almost electric atmosphere. It became clear to everyone in the courtroom that they were witnessing not just the recounting of facts, but a confrontation with deeply ingrained societal assumptions. Here was a man whose voice had been systematically suppressed since birth, now wielding it with authority and clarity, altering the dynamics of the case, and, in a small but significant way, the broader social order. The courtroom itself seemed to shift under the weight of this reality, moving from a space of rigid control to one where the power of truth and courage could not be denied. Importantly, the stunned reaction was not limited to those who opposed the idea of enslaved testimony. Some of the observers, perhaps sympathetic to the enslaved or quietly critical of the system, felt vindicated, as if the man's courage had given them a measure of hope. They realized that the long-standing assumptions of intellectual and moral superiority were being challenged in a very public and undeniable way. His words, measured and deliberate, had pierced through prejudice, leaving an impact that could not be erased by tradition or law. This reaction demonstrated the broader significance of the moment. It was not merely about a courtroom procedure or a single case. It was a demonstration of the transformative power of truth and courage in a society structured to deny both. The stunned faces, whispered reactions, and silent acknowledgement of his authority underscored the fact that even in a system designed to silence, one voice could disrupt, challenge, and inspire. By the time the testimony concluded, the entire room had been irrevocably changed. No one could walk away unaffected. Those who had doubted, dismissed, or feared him were forced to confront the reality of his intelligence, insight, and moral authority. The reactions of the courtroom, awe, shock, fear, and reluctant respect, captured a profound historical moment, a moment in which centuries of systemic suppression were briefly confronted, and the power of an individual's voice became impossible to ignore. It was a reaction that reverberated far beyond the walls of that room, a testament to the extraordinary significance of speaking truth in a world determined to deny it. The lasting impact of his words on law and history cannot be overstated, for they marked a profound turning point in the way enslaved people were perceived and, in some cases, treated within the legal system. While the immediate case may have concluded with a verdict that aligned with the era's expectations, the symbolic weight of his testimony resonated far beyond that courtroom. His words challenged the very foundation of a legal and social system that had long assumed that the lives, experiences, and observations of enslaved people were unworthy of recognition. By speaking the truth under oath, he demonstrated that knowledge, perception, and moral insight are not determined by social status or freedom, and that even those deemed voiceless can profoundly influence the course of justice. In the months and years following the trial, the case became a point of discussion among lawyers, judges, and even lawmakers in the region. Legal scholars debated the implications of allowing an enslaved person to testify, considering both the precedent it set and the challenges it posed to the entrenched racial hierarchy. While many in positions of power sought to minimize the significance of the testimony, dismissing it as an anomaly or a fluke, the story persisted in court records, local newspapers, and personal accounts. Each retelling carried the undeniable truth that a voice once silenced had spoken and had been heard, and that alone was revolutionary. The broader historical impact also lies in the precedent it created for other enslaved individuals. Although the law did not immediately change to universally allow enslaved people to testify, the very fact that one man had successfully taken the stand planted the seed of possibility. Others in similar circumstances could look to his courage as proof that speaking truth in the face of systemic oppression was possible, even if dangerous. His example became part of a growing, though often quiet, movement toward legal recognition and human dignity for those who had been denied it. Beyond the courtroom, his words resonated culturally and socially. Families, communities, and individuals who had been witnesses to or aware of the trial recognized the power of someone refusing to be silenced. Oral histories preserved the story, passing it down through generations as a testament to resilience, bravery, and moral fortitude. Even those who could not openly celebrate his actions acknowledged, in private conversations, that the event had shaken their understanding of hierarchy, authority, and justice. The narrative of a slave taking the witness stand became a subtle but persistent critique of a society that had long relied on silence as a tool of oppression. Moreover, the testimony contributed to a gradual shift in how historians and chroniclers approached the records of enslaved people. While much of history had been written from the perspective of those in power, cases like this revealed that enslaved individuals were not merely passive subjects of history, but active participants whose experiences and voices could not be ignored. Scholars who came across accounts of the trial were forced to grapple with the implications of his words and the broader reality they represented, that the humanity, intelligence, and moral reasoning of enslaved people had always existed, even if the law refused to acknowledge it. The moral impact of his testimony was equally profound. In stepping forward, he asserted not only his own dignity, but also the principle that truth cannot be wholly silenced. His words conveyed that justice, while often denied, can find expression through courage and clarity. For many observers, this challenged their assumptions and provoked a moral reckoning. How could a society continue to justify the systemic silencing and oppression of an entire class of people when confronted with the undeniable reality of such intelligence, insight, and bravery, even if only momentarily? The courtroom became a space where justice and human recognition intersected in a way that the rigid laws of the time rarely allowed. In a broader historical context, the testimony foreshadowed future struggles for civil rights and legal recognition. While it would take nearly a century for the law to formally recognize the rights and voices of all citizens regardless of race, moments like this laid the groundwork. They reminded the world, quietly, sometimes painfully, that every system of oppression contains cracks, and that individual acts of courage can exploit those cracks to make change possible. Each subsequent legal reform, each court case challenging racial inequality, echoes the significance of that moment when a man who had been denied voice for his entire life stood and spoke, refusing to be ignored. The lasting impact also extended to the perception of enslaved people in literature, storytelling, and cultural memory. His story inspired narratives that emphasized resilience, moral authority, and the pursuit of justice against overwhelming odds. Even in communities still grappling with the legacies of slavery, the knowledge that someone had once asserted their voice in such a public, undeniable manner provided a measure of hope and empowerment. It served as a quiet reminder that legal and societal structures are not infallible, and that individual courage can expose their weaknesses. Ultimately, the lasting impact of his words is measured not only in legal precedent, but in moral and cultural resonance. He transformed a moment that could have been forgotten into a symbol of resistance, truth, and human dignity. By stepping onto the witness stand, he demonstrated that even in a system designed to suppress and dehumanize, one voice could alter perceptions, challenge injustice, and leave an indelible mark on history. His testimony reminds us that the courage to speak truth in the face of overwhelming odds can echo far beyond a single case, influencing generations and redefining what is possible in the pursuit of justice and recognition.